I'm Cindy Woolley. I work here at Spicer Library in charge of adult programs. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the program. This is Joshua Noble. He is going to be the presenter. These are all of his artifacts. He has been interested in collecting items since he was 6. So would you say it was? Yeah, about that,
Yeah.
right? And you see we have all these, which are great. We also, in case you haven't seen them, there's a display case out in the library in the middle by the new books area. We can point you, if you're not familiar with the library, we can point you to that. And you can see additional ones. So I guess that's it.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Joshua Noble, and I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. If you need a restroom, if you go straight through these doors, straight.
Good afternoon. As she said, my name is Joshua Noble, and I've been studying the Titanic for a long time. With the fascination with Titanic, my interest has turned more towards the passengers and the crew, their lives and who they were, and also to more local connections. There's a lot of history all around us, that we don't even realize, and so I made it a goal of mine to track down as many connections to the Titanic through our local area, through our state, and through this area of the U.S. So today I'd like to talk about the 4 Georgians who were on the Titanic, and a lot of them were very prominent passengers. Of these 4, 3 didn't make it, and 1 lived to tell the tale and kept their legacy going. So the first passenger I would like to talk about is this man, Isidor Straus. He's probably one of the most famous passengers who was on the Titanic. Isidor Straus was the son of Lazarus and Sarah. He was born in Otterburg, Bavaria, which is now in Germany. At the age of 5, his family immigrated to the United States. Lazarus went ahead and established a business in southern Georgia, in Columbus and Talbotton. And let's see if I can. That's where the Strauss homestead used to be. It's now on a library site. It was a log cabin, and within walking distance was their shop. They sold multiple wares, including and especially silverware and china. They had a business called L. Strauss and Sons, and their china ended up being very popular in the area. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, the Strausses supported the Confederacy. Being from Georgia, they provided supplies and things to it, and Isidor acted as a secretary to the blockade runner. He spent a lot of the war in Europe, which I'm sure his family was happy with. To help with their studies, because they were the only Jewish passengers, Jewish people in the town, Lazarus had an agreement with the local minister to learn from the first 5 books of the Bible, and so that's the church where they were taught in. It still exists to this day. Following the Civil War, rather than go through the Reconstruction and everything that went on with that, Lazarus and his family moved up to New York City. From there, the Strausses became very successful. Nathan and Lazarus, both brothers, or Nathan and Isidor, both brothers, got involved with Macy's department store. They started by selling various items there and eventually became the owners of Macy's department store. And they are generally credited as the co-founders. And they were what made Macy's where it is today. While they were there, Isidor met and married Ida Blum, who was also a Jewish person from Germany. In 1896, Isidore was elected to the House of Representatives, where he served as a Democratic congressman from New York City. And while he was there, he became a close friend and confidant of President Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland ended up offering him the Postmaster General position, which Isidore ultimately declined. The Strausses never forgot about their roots in Georgia and later donated money to a women's college there. And their money was used to build Strauss-Livert Hall, which is now a community center in Talbotton. In 1912, Isidore and Ida were vacationing in Europe and buying things for Macy's when they boarded the Titanic in Southampton to return home. They had a suite on the Titanic, which most of y'all would recognize as the basis for the movie. The sitting room where Rose had was based on their sitting room. Strangely enough, however, their cabin had a shared bathroom. A lot of the first class passengers didn't have their own bathrooms. Early on in the voyage, Ida wrote a letter to a friend and said, "What a ship, so huge and so magnificently appointed. Our rooms are furnished in the best of taste and most luxuriously, as they are really rooms, not cabins." She went on to say that the ship nearly collided with another ship, the SS New York, which was drawn towards the Titanic with her massive hull, causing the New York's stern to swing towards her. Thankfully, a tugboat came in the nick of time and prevented the collision. Archibald Gracie, who was a first-class passenger and who was also from the South, he was from Mobile, Alabama, he befriended the Strausses, and he became especially enamored with Isidore upon learning that Isidore was a fellow Southerner and a Confederate veteran. Archibald Gracie's father was a Confederate veteran, and Archibald Gracie was returning home from writing a book entitled The Truth About Chickamauga, which is a book about his father's most famous battle. On April 14th, the Strausses briefly exchanged messages with their son, who was sailing towards Europe on the SS America. Later that evening, the Titanic collided with an iceberg. Mr. and Mrs. Strauss were seen on deck by multiple passengers and crew, including Archibald Gracie. According to eyewitnesses, Mrs. Strauss got into boat number 8 with her maid, Ellen Bird. But Mrs. Strauss quickly stood up and went back on deck. She went straight to Isidore and said, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." Mr. Gracie interjected and offered to see if one of the officers would let Isidore get into a lifeboat because of his age. Isidore refused, saying that he would not go before the other men. Mrs. Strauss gave her fur coat to Ellen, and the Strausses ended up staying together on the ship. They were last seen sitting in deck chairs, holding hands, and neither of them survived. Isidore's body was later recovered and identified, though Ida's was not. Isidore's body was claimed by the family and buried in New York City with other relatives. They were so loved by their employees that they took up a collection and had a plaque made to commemorate them, and it is in Macy's department store in New York City to this day. If any of you find yourselves in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, there's a very nice Titanic museum, and there you can see Mr. Strauss's wedding ring and messages related to the Strauss family in reference to Isidore. The next passenger is someone who had one of the most fascinating lives of anyone on the ship. And though he's largely ignored largely due to his name was Major Archibald Willingham Butt. His friends called him Archie. Archie was born in 1865, right after the end of the Civil War in Augusta, Georgia. not long after Augusta was spared from Sherman's fires during his march to the sea, although Augusta was not spared from the Reconstruction afterwards. Archie's father, his name was Joshua, was a local businessman. He did his best to care for his family and provide for them, but unfortunately he died when Archie was 11 years old. This wasn't the only tragedy in Archie's life, as he also lost 2 siblings growing up. What got Archie through it was the dedication of his mother. His mother, Pamela, was determined to not let her son's circumstances growing up determine how they would end up later in life. She made sure that they got into good schools and made something of themselves. And with Archie, she was able to use her friendship with one of the ministers to get into Sewanee University, nicknamed the University of the South. While he was there, Archie became interested in 2 things, the military and journalism. Because of his mother, he did not enter the military just yet, but instead became a journalist, working for multiple newspapers in the South and writing articles as a correspondent. But as the American-Filipino War broke out, Archie decided to join the military as he wished previously. He got a commission in the United States Army as a volunteer. He was made a quartermaster, and his first job was to transport livestock across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines. He did so successfully without a single animal being lost. And it was there when Archie first met his friend, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was at the time governor of the Philippines, and they got along very well together. Archie was later transferred to Havana, Cuba for a short time before being made military aide to President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt and Archie became very close. Once Roosevelt learned that Archie was from Georgia and Roosevelt's mother was from Atlanta, they started to bond. A notable thing that happened between the two was one day when, because President Roosevelt decided to require that all his military officers be able to ride a horse for 18 miles, he got complaints. And so Roosevelt decided to prove that it could be done. So Roosevelt, together with Archie and several other men, rode on horseback 100 miles in a single day. They rode 50 miles to deliver a speech in Virginia and 50 miles back. They got in after nightfall. After Taft became president of the United States and succeeded Roosevelt, Taft asked Archie to stay on as military aide, which Archie did so. And the two became even closer. Taft relied on Archie heavily. And at one point when Mrs. Taft had a stroke, Archie made sure that the First Lady was cared for and made sure that Mr. Taft had the ability to care for his wife and run this country. It so happened that when she had the stroke, they were having a large dinner that night. And so to keep this from getting out and being made public, they decided to, Archie made sure that everything was covered up and made sure that no one knew about it until months later. In April 1912, following a really physically strenuous several years, Archie's health was noticeably starting to decline, so his good friend Frank Millet decided to take him on a vacation to Europe, and together they went. Archie went on official business to visit the Pope and gave him a letter from President Taft, and in return the Pope gave Archie a picture of His Holiness as well as a letter back to Taft. Archie went to see his brother Edward in England before boarding the Titanic in Southampton. And that's the last photograph of Archie. You can see him in the back wearing a trench coat. That was on the forward A-deck promenade taken by Father Brown. On April 14th, he was invited to a private dinner party in the a la carte restaurant hosted by Mr. and Mrs. Widener in honor of Captain E.J. Smith. Following that, Archie played cards in the first class smoking room with a lot of other gentlemen and was there when the iceberg was struck. Archie went down to his cabin. He burned the letter that the Pope had written to keep it from falling in the wrong hands and went back on deck. There are multiple accounts of Archie's actions and what he did that night. Unfortunately, a lot of them ended up being not as factual. Archie was among the most popular survivors following the disaster. The press loved him, not only for his experience in journalism, but also for his closeness to the president and his overall attitude. After his death on the Titanic, Taft did everything he could to try and make sure that Archie's body was recovered and returned, although his body was never found. In 1914, a bridge was dedicated to Archie in Augusta, Georgia. It's still there to this day. It's called Butt Memorial Bridge, and Taft went to dedicate it in his memory. At the memorial service, President Taft eulogized Archie well by saying if Archie would have selected a time to die, he would have chosen the one God gave him. His life was spent in self-sacrifice, serving others. His forgetfulness of self had become a part of his nature. Everybody who knew him called him Archie. I couldn't prepare anything in advance to say here. I tried, but I couldn't. He was too near to me. He was loyal to my predecessor, Mr. Roosevelt, who selected him to be a military aide, and to me, he had become as a son or a brother. The next passengers I would like to talk about are Jacques and Lily Futrell. Jacques was born on April 9th, 1875 in Pike County, Georgia. His father was a teacher at a college in Atlanta, and he from early on had an interest in writing. At the age of 18, he took a job at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he would become one of the first writers of the sports section in the newspaper's history. In 1895, he married Lily Mae Peel in the backyard of her father's home in Atlanta. Lily Mae Peel Futrell was born on May 26, 1876 in Atlanta and spent most of her life there. Together they had two children named John and Virginia. Not long after their marriage, Jacques accepted a job at the New York Herald, and the Futrells moved to New York City. They didn't live there long, however, before Jacques accepted another position as a manager of a theater in Richmond, Virginia in 1902. At around this time, Jacques' writings began to turn more towards plays. He wrote plays and performed in some of them. Meanwhile, Lily was very much involved in her husband's work, helping to direct plays and write them as well. After 2 years, he got a job with the Boston America and moved to Massachusetts, where they bought a lovely beachfront home and raised their family. It was during that time that Jacques Futrell wrote some of his best and well-known books, including The Thinking Machine, a science fiction novel. That book has prompted some to call him the father of modern science fiction. He also wrote a popular mystery novel, which prompted some to call him the American Conan Doyle. In 1912, they were vacationing in Europe, for a few weeks on holiday. Even though they were vacationing, Jacques' mind was still working. He wrote several short stories while he was there and meant to publish them when he got back home. They celebrated Jacques' birthday on April 9th, partied long into the night, ending it at 3 a.m. Because they boarded the Titanic at Southampton the next day, they decided not to go to bed and instead packed their things and went to the train station. They had cabin C-123 located near the after-grand staircase, not far from the cabins of other famous writers. William T. Stead being one, he was a famous journalist and spiritualist, and Henry B. Harris, who was a theater manager in New York City. And speaking of the voyage, Lily later said, "There was not the slightest thought of danger in our minds, of those as we sat around the tables in the luxurious dining saloon of the Titanic. It was a brilliant crowd. Jewels flashed from the gowns of the women, how fondly they wore the Parisian gowns. It was the first time many of them had the opportunity to display their newly acquired finery. After the collision with the iceberg, the Futrells made their way to the boat deck, where they found themselves near collapsible D. Lily decided that she wanted to stay with Jacques, and she made several attempts to stay with him, but he said no. He said, "For God's sake, get in a lifeboat." And he made sure that she got into a lifeboat, and she survived and he did not. She continued to carry on his legacy. Unfortunately, most of the papers that he wrote in Europe were lost, but there was one book that he wrote before he left called My Lady's Garter, which was later published. The family thought that both of them had survived, and the news wasn't clear from the Carpathia, and so when the family went to greet them, they thought that both would come down the gangway, and instead only Lily made it down the gangway. And when she got down, she had to tell the children that their father didn't make it. That's Lily in New York City, right after the sinking. That's her in the center.